God makes all things good. Man meddles with them, and they become evil. Welcome to Philosophers, explained by me, Stephen Hicks. This series covers major philosophers and core texts in intellectual history, especially the great classics. From each, I've selected an excerpt. 40 minutes or so is our target, and our purpose is to do a close reading of an important work with the accompanying text. In this episode, we're turning to Jean Jacques Rousseau and his 1762 work, Emile, or Education. Let's go to the text. I want to begin our discussion of this extraordinary work, Emile, or Education. The influence is incalculable since it was published in 1762. By putting it in broader political and philosophical context for Rousseau. Part of the reason is that this is a work on education. Education begins at birth for Rousseau, but as he argues, you can't do education without having an idea of what the purpose of education is, or what you want the output, final product of education is to be. And for that, we need to have a broader philosophical and political context. And for Rousseau, his purpose is to create a citizen and a modern citizen. So I've got, for context setting, 5 quotations from Emile, a little bit later in the work than the parts that we're going to consider. We're going to be looking at book 1, but also from another influential work that was published in the same year, The Social Context. And these two works together then give us a strong indication of Rousseau's thinking at the time of 1762. So when we form a political society, and that's already a modern way of putting the question, the idea is that society does not pre-exist eternally and is not imposed upon us. How does this happen? Rousseau wants to argue it is a contract. It's a contract that involves a commitment by all of the member parts to create something new. So what is the nature of this social contract that we are creating? And Rousseau says this in The Social Contract. Each coalesces with all. In this, each of us puts in common his person and his whole power under the supreme direction of society's leaders. Unquote. When we join, quote, the individual particularity of each contracting party is surrendered to a new moral and collective body which has its own life, self, body, and will. So what we have here is a strong statement of political collectivism, or an organic view of society, and it requires that all of the individuality that we start with perhaps naturally needs to be surrendered. We need to do so voluntarily, and we lose our individuality and become part of a new collective, and we then follow the direction of that collective. Now, the directors or the legislators, the people who are in a position more than others to shape this new entity, quote, whoever dares undertake to establish a people's institutions must feel himself capable of changing, as it were, human nature, of transforming each individual. Now I'm going to pause right there, and already this is a strong claim. So we're not going to take human nature as it is, seeing it as inflexible, as unchanging, and we just work with that existing human nature. What the political legislators are going to do is transform human nature into something new. And that's a very strong claim as well, with implications, of course, for education. Carrying on the quotation here. Each individual, who by himself is a complete and solitary whole, into part of a larger whole, from which the individual receives his life and his being. He, that is to say, the new founder, has to take from man his own powers and give him in exchange alien powers, which he cannot employ without the help of other men. So we start as individuals with our own powers, and we become beings that cannot function as individuals anymore, but have powers only as part of this new collectivity. The place of religion in philosophy, in morality, and in politics. This is from the work we're going to be considering a little bit later, Book 4, Emile. Rousseau is a religious person, but he's not a traditional religious person, and we'll start to see some of the indications here. So, I believe the world is governed by a wise and most powerful will. I see it, or rather I feel it. I see God everywhere in his works. In vain do you argue this point with me. I feel it, and it is this feeling that speaks to me more forcibly than any reason which could dispute it. And this is important philosophically, because the question is, how do we form our core beliefs? And Rousseau is arguing, at least on this core belief, it is not a matter of reason. Rather, it is a matter of feeling. And so this also then is going to have implications for education. The feeling education is going to be more appropriate, or important rather, than rational education. Religion, however, is not just a private individual matter. We can infer that by integrating that quote with the previous two. It is going to be a politically charged issue, and while Rousseau is writing in the 1700s, the age of Enlightenment, where the idea of religious plurality, the separation of state and church, or the separation of religion from politics, is a growing movement culturally, intellectually, and politically. Rousseau is rejecting that modern approach. The legislator must have recourse to an authority capable of constraining without violence. Now we'll pause there. Of course, the legislator will have police power at his or her disposal, but the police can't be everywhere at all time, and so a well-ordered state is going to need an additional source of authority aside from police authority. This is in what all ages compelled the fathers of nations to have recourse to divine intervention and to credit the gods with their own wisdom, in order that the peoples, submitting to the laws of nature as to those of nature, might obey freely and bear with docility the yoke of the public good. So religion and overt political force, the law, will jointly get people to obey, and so it's an essential tool. Now, how far do we want to go in enforcing the state religion, or enforcing religion? And Rousseau wants to argue pretty far. Quote, while the state can compel no one to believe, it can banish, not for impiety, but as an antisocial being, incapable of truly loving the laws, and of sacrificing, if needed, his life to his duty. If anyone, after publicly recognizing these dogmas, behaves as if he does not believe him, let him be punished by death. So, either a banishment of people who do not believe, or who continue to challenge and critique the state religion, and those who become too forceful in doing so, those people should be executed. Now, all of this means that Rousseau is not part of the Enlightenment or part of liberalism in the individualistic sense that was prominent in the 1700s. Nonetheless, he's not an old-fashioned or a traditionalist, a religious authoritarian type of person, and he was in fact criticized harshly and persecuted by the more traditional religious authoritarians, and particularly in 1762 when Emile, the book that we are considering, was published. And so there was no church-state separation at that point, so the Catholic authorities complained about the publication of Emile, and the king's government at the time agreed. The book was then burned publicly in front of the Palais de Justice, and they decided that Rousseau should be arrested. Now, Rousseau was tipped off. He heard that the arrest was imminent, and so he escaped quickly from France and went to neighboring Switzerland. And I'll put this quotation up here, but in the course of the public burning, the King's Council, speaking of Rousseau's political purposes, but more specifically about what's going on in Emile, has this to say about the work. Quote, Rousseau's goal was to destroy the truth of sacred scripture and the prophecies, the certitude of the miracles described in the holy books, the infallibility of revelation, and the authority of the church. So an extraordinarily controversial work that was to become extraordinarily influential, and in some ways it seems old-fashioned religious authoritarians, but in other ways it is quite subversive of traditional authoritarianism. So what is this controversial work? All right, so the title is Emile. This book is partly a first-person essay that Rousseau is writing about education, but at the various points he introduces characters. The main character is Emile, and Emile interacts with various other characters, a young woman named Sophie, there's a Savoyard vicar, and various other people who are introduced along the way. So rhetorically, it's an interesting composition in that way. But let's have a look at some key ideas as they are developed in the preface and book one of Emile. Now, in the preface, Rousseau makes a point of mentioning John Locke and his extraordinarily influential book that had been published, it would be 60, 70 years prior to Rousseau's Emile, published in the early 1690s, and this is one of the first great modern treatises on education for the new enlightened modernist era. And he argues, or indicates rather here, Rousseau, that Locke's book is foundational, that he has read the book, and you can see some of the influence of Lockean ideas in Emile if you have had a look at both of them. So I invite you to go to our other episode of Philosophers Explained, where we do look at Locke's thoughts concerning education. Even so, Locke's book was quite short. There's a great deal still to be developed on the basis of Lockean ideas, and Rousseau is going to disagree fundamentally with several of Locke's important ideas, so he wants to take things in a different direction. But one important point that Rousseau emphasizes in the preface that is a very modern point is the idea of developmentalism. And here's the quotation: "We know nothing of childhood. Right? Even the wisest writers devote themselves to what a man ought to know without asking what a child is capable of learning. They are always looking for the man in the child without considering what he is before he becomes a man." And this is important because Rousseau is going to argue that life goes through various developmental stages, and that is kind of a commonplace point by the time we get into modernity, but it was not obvious. And what we did find in many writings on education from ancient, medieval, and even early modern times was this is what we want the adult human being to look and be, and then we just take all of those things and start to instruct the child with respect to those. So we are at least implicitly taking the child just to be a tiny adult human being with the same needs, capacities, powers, and so forth. And by the same token, what we sometimes do is we take the child and just say it's a simple matter of scaling it up to an adult human being. But what Rousseau is going to argue, agreeing with Locke here, is that we have to look at distinctive developmental stages, biologically and psychologically, and change the methods of education that we are going to use depending on what stages the child is at. Now, the famous opening line from Book 1, "God makes all things good. Right? Man meddles with them and they become evil." Now, this sounds initially like it is a traditional religious position of original sin. God made the world perfect, perhaps a Garden of Eden type of world. Human beings came into the world and messed things up. But there is a major difference here between Rousseau's advocacy of this position and the more traditional position. The more traditional position believes that human beings are by nature bad, wicked, evil, the doctrine of original sin. And so inside of us, we already have a certain corruption, and it's our corruption then that we act on to change and make the world worse than God had created it. What Rousseau is going to argue is that where there is no original sin, instead human beings are born at least neutral but with good tendencies. And so the men who are doing the meddling here are the men who over the course of generations have created corrupt social institutions. And it is those social institutions, the way we are doing things right now, that are going to corrupt each new generation of human beings, as well as building on the corruption already that is in society. So the problem is not with human beings, it's going to be with social institutions. And that makes Rousseau in contrast to many traditional religious figures. He destroys and defaces all things. He loves all that is deformed and monstrous. He will have nothing as nature made it. And so here we have Rousseau arguing that culture, civilization, all things man-made and artificial are a source of corruption and badness. And so by contrast, what we need to do is respect nature, get back to nature, not live an artificial life, lead a genuine life in contact with nature. And this is interesting that behind nature, he does believe that there is a God, but nonetheless the emphasis is on nature. And at the same time, he is arguing that nature does not need to be improved significantly by meddling man. And this is another point that's going to put Rousseau in contrast to the Enlightenment figures who are very enamored with science and industry and engineering and all of the arts which they see as improving upon nature. Rousseau is in disagreement with them. So we can't, however, just let children be as they are naturally and leave them go, because then we would be turning them into this corrupt society, and that would be a problem. Yet, things would be worse without this education. Under existing conditions, a man left to himself from birth would be more of a monster than the rest. And we become a monster because of all of these things that he would be surrounded with in existing society. Prejudice, authority, necessity, example, all the social conditions into which we are plunged would stifle nature in him. So, what Rousseau then wants to argue, and first he's appealing from the beginning to the mother. The mother is the first educator. Tender, anxious mother, I appeal to you. You can remove this young tree from the highway and shield it from the crushing force of social conventions. So what we then need to do as parents is not so much insulate the child from nature, certainly not insulate the child from God, but rather insulate the child from other human beings, and particularly other human beings who have shaped all of the predominant institutions of civilization. Civilization, on Rousseau's view, is not an improvement over nature, rather it is a corruption. It is a bad thing. Plants are fashioned by cultivation, man by education. Another very interesting thing about this opening is the number of horticultural and biological metaphors that Rousseau introduces into his works. They're not explicitly religious, they're not artificial metaphors. Instead, we are part of nature, we are biological creatures, and we see this emphasized. Trees in a garden, cultivation. Keep an eye out for that language. All right, nonetheless, human beings are going to be social beings, and we do want to recreate society in a certain direction. And even the initial family unit is a social entity. What is the right scale of social institution? It's not just human beings as isolated atoms out in nature. Nonetheless, we don't want to put them in the wrong kind of society, and as Rousseau is going to argue, have the society be too large. The smaller social group, firmly united in itself and dwelling apart from the others, tends to withdraw itself from the larger society. Every patriot hates foreigners. They are only men and nothing to them. And so what Rousseau is going to argue is there's something natural about our tribal identity, that we're not citizens or rather going to be citizens of the world, or globalists, or cosmopolitans. And so the appropriate level of social interaction is going to be at the level of something on the order of a tribe. Not necessarily a tribe in the feudal sense, where we're hierarchically structured in classes and castes and so on, but nonetheless, if we think, for example, of Rousseau's native Switzerland, and the Swiss think of themselves then as Swiss, but also they think of themselves as regionally parts of various cantons, or the different regions of France, and we don't want to get things too large. The way he puts it here a little further down is distrust those cosmopolitans. And already, as we get into the 1700s, we are getting into a global economy. All of the world is being mapped out and explored, and interactions in business and commerce with people all over the world. And people are starting to think of themselves much more cosmopolitan. Why should I think of myself as a member of this narrower tribal group? And Rousseau is saying that is a danger. And he then praises historically certain groups. Notice, for example, the emphasis, or the highlighting rather here, of the Spartans. So the Spartans were selfish, grasping, and unjust with respect to anybody who was not a Spartan. But inside the Spartan group, he was unselfish, just, and harmonious. And so Rousseau thinks that is appropriate. Also, interestingly, for those interested in Greek history, Rousseau is almost always praiseworthy when it comes to, or praiseful rather, when it comes to the Spartans, but critical when it comes to the Athenians. The Athenians were much more individualistic, much more free market, cosmopolitan traders. The Spartans were much more tribal, internal to their ethnic group, and kept barriers with respect to outer groups. He makes a similar point about the Romans, particularly the early Romans. Being a citizen of Rome meant not only that you were not an individual, you didn't see yourself as primarily having your own personal interests, rather your citizenship obligations to Rome trumped, but also you saw Rome as special with respect to and against all of the other tribal groups that were out there. So he mentions here, a citizen, he ever loved his country better than his life. So a value judgment. Your citizenship and your country takes precedence over yourself. And then proper education is going to instill this in individuals. Another interesting example from the Spartans. The Spartans are at war, and here's an example of a well-trained, a well-educated Spartan mother with her moral and political values in the proper order, according to Rousseau. A Spartan mother had 5 sons with the army. A helot, that's a Spartan slave, arrived with news. Trembling, she asked his news. How did the war go? The helot replies, your 5 sons are slain. The Spartan mother is angry. Vile slave, was that what I asked thee? The helot corrects himself. We have won the victory. She, the mother, hastened to the temple to render thanks to the gods. That was a citizen. So naturally we think of mothers as kind of selfish. These are my children, and my children come first, and I don't want my children to go off to war because they might get killed. And so there's a tension between that stereotypical understanding of the mother's values and political values. But what Rousseau is arguing here, that the Spartans had it right in this particular example. For this Spartan mother, the fact that her sons died in the war is less important to her than that Sparta won the war. Sparta first, my personal affections come second. And so education needs to take that value framework into account. All right, moving on, just highlighting that among historical philosophers, Rousseau is also praiseful of Plato, and indicates that here, if you wish to know what is meant by public education, read Plato's Republic. There are going to be some differences between Rousseau and Plato, but by and large, Plato is on the right track according to Rousseau. We also have an episode in Philosophers Explained on Plato. I invite you to check that one out as well. Further praise here for Lycurgus, who was the founding legislator of Sparta. And then an important point about when education begins. And notice that it starts quite early here. Often earlier writers on education would say education is something that comes a little bit later. There's infancy, early childhood, and when we start to talk about education, we assume that education starts at the point perhaps where we have more formal education. Perhaps we hire a tutor, or we send the child off to school, and we have some sort of then official strategic institution that's going to be the beginning of education. For Rousseau, education begins at birth. It's a broader concept of education. We begin to learn when we begin to live. Our education begins with ourselves. Our first teacher is our nurse. So at the mother's breast or at the nursemaid's breast, that is the beginning of life. That is the beginning of education. Returning to this theme that civilization is not a positive word for Rousseau, it is a negative word for him. Our wisdom, and by which he is speaking of the prevailing wisdom, the so-called smart people, the philosophical wise people of his time, our wisdom is slavish prejudice. Our customs consist in control, constraint, compulsion. Civilized man is born and dies a slave. And that's, again, a very striking point about Rousseau's assessment of his time. It's not a time of great liberalization. Instead, he sees it as a time of just newer institutions of coercion and control, not so different from many of the traditional institutions of coercion and control. And then what he notices and gives us an example here is right from the beginning how in civilized times we dress our children. The infant is bound up in swaddling clothes. And so right from the beginning, we wrap the child up tightly in blankets so that the kid can't even move around. We hold the child tightly. Maybe we're afraid the child is going to fall, or we're afraid that the child is going to not be warm enough, right, and so forth. But the point is that we are constraining and controlling the child's body and inhibiting free natural movement. And so right from beginning, trapped in swaddling clothes to the end, the corpse is nailed down in his coffin. All his life long, man is imprisoned by his institutions. And then sarcastically, our heads aren't good enough as God made them. He's mentioning, how sometimes people will try to mold and shape the child's head even. Our heads are not good enough as God made them. They must be molded outside by the nurse and inside by the philosopher. So it's just control, 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 and Rousseau wants to reject all of that. The way he puts it here, the newborn child requires to stir and stretch his limbs to free them from the stiffness resulting from being curled up so long. So let the child be free, be open, move around to whatever extent the child has that capacity. And that's going to be a dominant theme over the course of the first few years of education as Rousseau sees it. Maximizing the lack of constraints, or minimizing constraints, maximizing the amount of liberty that the child is going to have to be able to move around as he or she needs to. Now he then starts to introduce some empirical evidence here, difference between people who are raised in cities and people who are raised in the country, or children who are allowed to run around by their parents compared to children who are tightly regulated and constricted by their parents. And he makes then a developmental claim. Where these absurd precautions are absent, all the men are tall, strong, and well made. Where children are swaddled, the country swarms with the humpbacked, the lame, the bow-legged, the rickety, and every kind of deformity. Now, maybe we're doing this because we are afraid of the world and we're afraid of all of the dangerous things, and so we overprotect our children. And Rousseau says that's just the wrong attitude. We make our children helpless lest they should hurt themselves. So the advice he's going to give is let children go free. Yes, of course, they're going to hurt themselves. And there are dangers, of course, out there in the world. But that is better than the swaddling and the overprotectiveness. The only way children can become strong is by suffering a certain amount of pain and injury. They will recover and get to be strong. Now, the statistics from middle part of the 1700s are quite harsh. It says, look, sickness and death and danger and injury, those are part of life. They are part of nature. That's what nature intends, if we can anthropomorphize a little bit here. And the statistics are quite scary. Sickness and danger play the chief part in infancy. The chief part in infancy. 1/2 of the children who are born die before their 8th year. 50% death rate, and actually the death rate was higher in the cities where people are congregated, often in unsanitary conditions. This is well before modern sanitation and well before modern medicine, although Rousseau was going to be quite hostile toward medical practice of his time. In the country, the death rates were a little bit lower. But the child who has overcome hardships has gained strength. As soon as he can use his life, he holds it more securely. And again, this is nature's law. Notice he doesn't say this is what God intends. He's more naturalistic and more modern in this way. This is nature's law. Why contradict it? Okay, next point about more formal education by the time that we get to it. This is interestingly another point in which Rousseau is going to be in agreement with Plato, for example. We are going to more formally educate the child, and perhaps we are considering hiring a tutor or bringing a tutor on board. The question that Rousseau is pointing to here is about the proper moral motivation of the tutor. And he says the tutor should not be doing it for payment or for any sort of reward. He should be doing it as a sense of obligation or as a sense of social duty toward other human beings. And Plato had made this same point about his enlightened beings once they had escaped the cave, for example. They have an obligation to go back into the cave or to enlighten the currently unenlightened beings. The discussion characteristics, this is now Rousseau, of a good tutor. He should not take up his task for reward. So this would then indicate that any sort of private school or that is for profit, or someone who is taking the job as a tutor, not seeing it as an obligation but doing it just to make a living, that's not the right kind of purpose or motivation rather for someone to become a tutor. He indicates the method of his book here, so this is where he introduces Emile. So far it's been Rousseau speaking in the first person, but he's going to introduce Emile as a youth and then growing into a young man, and imagine how he, if he were Emile's tutor, Rousseau, would educate him. Comes back to this theme of modern medicine. Of course, the modern doctors are starting to play, well, we're becoming more scientific, we're going to make improvements, we're developing all of these instruments and so on. Instead of just letting children die as nature's law, what we should is through science and art try to cure diseases and so forth. And Rousseau says that is just a wrong direction to go. This lying art, invented rather for the ills of the mind than of the body, is useless to both alike. It does less to cure us of our diseases than to fill us with alarm. So this is going to have implications then for surgeries, for vaccines and inoculations, all of which were in their infancy at their time. But then whether as a matter of public policy, we're going to emphasize medicine, medical science, medical engineering or not, Rousseau is on the side of letting nature and natural remedies take their course. So, indicating a preference now for the natural life, and that then is going to mean for Rousseau, as much as possible, getting away from city life and particularly urban life. In the modern world, it's the dramatic rise of cities and the concentration of large numbers of people, and Rousseau argues that this is not only physically unhealthy, but it's also psychologically, morally, and politically unhealthy to congregate so many people together in one place. But here he's emphasizing, particularly in the early days of childhood, the preference for fresh air and the country life, not the city life at all. But he does make the point more generally, not only just about children. Men are not made to be crowded together in anthills, but scattered over the earth to till it. And here the anthills are, metaphorical, and you get a bunch of ants together and they start to build structures in a vertical direction. And that's what human beings do. You put a whole bunch of them together, they start to build structures that are crowded and in a vertical direction. So that's not appropriate for us. So we shouldn't be building up cities, rather we should be farming, tilling the earth out in the country. The more they are massed together, the more corrupt they become. Not only physically corrupt, but also morally corrupt. So city living, urban life, and all of that apparatus of civilization is bad and a corruption. Oh, a more general point then, going back to education, and what Rousseau is going to want to emphasize here is, particularly in the early ages, like the Spartans, he thinks that for the first 5 years or so, the child belongs to the mother, but then at that point, state education will take over. The child belongs to the state for more formal education. But in these early days especially, the only habit the child should be allowed to contract is that of having no habits. And what Rousseau is going against is, again, all of those traditional forms of child rearing and education that say, right from the beginning, we need to take this being and, if we think the being is unformed, instill in it proper habits, proper rules, lay it on it in order to structure the child properly. Or if we think that the child is born with badness, with sin built into it, that could easily become habitual, we need right from the very beginning to instill all sorts of countervailing habits and rules in order to counteract the bad habits that are already built into the being. And Rousseau is disagreeing fundamentally with both of those. Let nature have its way with the young child. He goes on to argue that children are not born in sin. And this, of course, is going to put him in direct contrast to much of ancient and early modern traditions as they have evolved. Children are not born wicked. They are just weak. All wickedness, so-called, right, comes from weakness. The child is only naughty because he is weak. Make him strong and he will be good. Children don't know any better, and they also don't physically have the tools or the capacities and the self-control yet. So whatever they do, we might try an animal metaphor here, right? If you think of a young puppy, it's just all over the place. And yeah, it's going to do a lot of damage. It's not because the puppy is evil or wicked. It's just weak and it doesn't know any better. Same thing for children. Prior to the development of our conscience and prior to the development of our reason, which for Rousseau comes many years later, children are by and large amoral beings. They are just weak and they don't know any better. So let them develop their physical capacities and learn what works and does not, and then their consciences and their reason will develop and they will become moral agents. Before the age of reason, we do good or ill without knowing it. There is no morality in our actions. We are amoral beings. So, to close out this first book and these excerpts that I've selected here, Rousseau leaves us with 4 maxims, or 4 just kind of general rules of thumbs for parents and other forms of educators to go by. First maxim: far from being too strong, Right? Children are not strong enough for all the claims of nature. Give them full use of such strength as they have, they will not abuse it. So what they need to do is develop their strength, and then as a result of developing their strength, they will develop the self-control and recognize what's appropriate when they're interacting with nature and other people. The problem is not that they have all of these powerful, wicked desires that need to be constrained or restrained, and that we need to distrust children's powers, that they don't have enough power. Okay. Second, help them and supply the experience and strength they lack whenever the need is of the body. And it's interesting that he's emphasizing the body and physical sides of things. Children can't do certain things for themselves physically. Let them do as much as they can physically by themselves. And it's just if they have a need but they can't supply it themselves, then as the parent or educator, help that out. Third maxim, in the help you give them, confine yourself to what is really needful. Right? No luxuries. Don't put too much on the child or give the child beyond what he or she actually needs at that given time, without granting anything to caprice or unreason. For they will not be tormented by caprice if you do not call it into existence. So if you from the beginning give children all sorts of toys and sweets that they don't really need, then of course they will become capricious and demand all of those things that they don't really need. They will become artificial needs to them, and then you'll have all sorts of problems. But if you don't expose them to those things, those not genuine needs from the beginning, that problem will look after itself. Study carefully their speech and gestures so that at an age when they are incapable of deceit, you may discriminate between those desires which come from nature and those which spring from perversity. So each child is going to be different, develop in different ways and with different interests and different things that he or she has been exposed to. So this is not going to be a one-size-fits-all kind of a parenting or educational approach. So study them carefully, but then be mindful of the distinction between natural desires and the development of natural desires. Encourage those versus all of those that are artificial, that if encouraged are only going to lead to perversity. And then a very modern point, the spirit of these rules is to give children more real liberty and less power, to let them do more for themselves and demand less of others, so that by teaching them from the first to confine their wishes within the limits of their powers, they will scarcely feel the want of whatever is not in their power. Physical education, psychological education, and moral education right from the get-go will set young children up for what then will become at the later stages proper education, and particularly political education.